2-minute past. I'm so pleased to have Rem Koning with us today. We only give one speaker slot in our seminar series a term to a Harvard Business School professor, and Rem is the one for this term. He's assistant professor in the strategy unit at HBS, studies entrepreneurs and how they build their firms, broaden the benefits of their startup growth and innovation. He's going to talk today about sampling bias in entrepreneurial experiments, evidence from a product launch platform. And just to reiterate our logistics for the seminar series, if you wouldn't mind staying on mute and killing your camera while we're in session, it'll make for a better experience when we're recording it and using it later. If you could put your questions into chat, Hong Yi will be monitoring the chat, and if there's a question about clarification, or if you can't believe what Rem just said, then feel free to put it in there and Hong Yi will interrupt. Otherwise, we'll collect them and focus on the last 5 or 10 minutes of the session on Q&A. So Rem, very good to have you again. Thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for joining today. Excited to share this paper that is joint with Sam Cow, who used to be here at Harvard Business School, but is now an assistant professor at the Stockholm School of Economics, and Raman Ananda, who also used to be here at Harvard Business School, but has moved to Imperial in London and is doing really interesting stuff now across the pond. Despite them both trying to run away from me, they've been fantastic co-authors. Just want to call them out on this paper. So this paper is on sampling bias in entrepreneurial experiments, and I'm going to try to go for about 50 minutes on this, make sure I leave 10 minutes at the end so we can have a bit of a free-flowing Q&A. But let me walk you through what we're doing here. And over the next 50 minutes, I'm going to start just with a preview of the setting and the findings. So David mentioned that there's a platform involved here. That's sort of the connection to digitization. I'll describe that platform, describe what we find in case you have to drop off or you spill coffee on your computer, and you can no longer hear what's happening. Then I'll dive a little bit more into the theoretical background of the study, go over our results, and then sort of end with a conclusion and next steps. So the setting we're going to be analyzing today, the platform is Product Hunt. If you're not familiar with Product Hunt, you're all on a computer right now, I'm assuming. You can go to producthunt.com and look at what products have launched today. And it's a mix of big industry companies, right? So LinkedIn might launch a new product and put it on Product Hunt. It's startups, right, that have a new product. They're a completely new company, and they'll go on Product Hunt to gain attention. People vote on the products on Product Hunt, so you can see the number of votes there. It's used to gain attention beyond the users who are on the platform. You also get a lot of media coverage. So you'll end up with reporters coming on the platform, VCs, angels, using the platform to discover products. There's a lot of successes that have come out of it. And I'll talk about some of those in a second. It used to be a subsidiary of AngelList. It's since spun out. As I mentioned, large companies like Stripe and LinkedIn use it. It's primarily, though, a launchpad for entrepreneurs to get user feedback. So the day trading app Robinhood, which went on to raise over $300 million in VC financing, launched on product. Arrow Routers, which was acquired by Amazon, also launched on Product Hunt. Lots of successful companies have used it to start. If you Google how to optimize my product launch, you'll see that this is something that startup founders spend time thinking about to make sure they maximize the success when they come on this platform. The focus of our paper is going to be on these early stage startups, right? So we're going to exclude the incumbents. We're going to focus on 6,000 tech product launches between October 2016 and October 2018. One last note to convince you that Product Hunt does matter, and it's a platform with import. MIT's very own alum, Jorge Guzman, who's now a professor at Columbia Business School. This is him on Twitter saying, hey, I want you guys to give great feedback to some of my entrepreneurial students at Columbia Business School. Go check out their Product Hunt launch, right? So I think if it's something that Jorge is pitching that his students should use and they should get feedback from, it's something that I hope you all buy is an important platform in the larger entrepreneurial ecosystem. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this platform to understand how it impacts the direction of startup innovation. And in particular, this goes back to the sampling bias idea. What I'm going to show you in a minute is that this platform, Product Hunt, and other platforms like it are dominated by male users. So in the case of Product Hunt, 9 in 10 of the people who come on the platform to vote are men, right? And you can imagine, just like in the social sciences, that this might distort what we learn from testing on the sample. right? If we're launching a startup that's aimed at the needs of women, right? It's a technology startup. We're looking for how we're going to grow. We go on product hunt, and 9 out of the 10 of the users are men, and they give us signals on our startup, right? That may dissuade us from continuing, right, with our work, right? We might end up saying, no one really likes it. Even if the men aren't quote unquote biased, you might imagine that you're only going to get 1 user who likes it instead of 9 users who like your product, right? And that might lead you to prematurely shut down. So what we're going to do is we're going to unpack the question on this platform. The way we're going to do that is, first, for all the startups that launch on the platform, we're going to estimate whether they're more or less likely to appeal to men or women. We're going to show that female-focused startups that launch on Product Hunt experience 40% lower growth in the year after launching on the platform. And this is not growth on the platform. The digital platform we're studying is where we're going to see the startups that launch, but we're going to have growth measures that are the startup's total growth, right, from a separate data source. So it's not just that I'm getting fewer users on Product Hunt, I'm getting fewer users overall. I'm also 5% less likely to have an active user base, a sign that the startup has shut down, a year after launching on the platform, if I appeal more to the needs of women. We're going to show also that on days when the platform's newsletter exogenously increases female engagement with the platform, this gender gap shrinks, right? Suggesting the sampling bias mechanism. When there are more women you're testing your idea with and you're a female-focused startup, right, you seem to be getting better signals of future success. We show that it has outcomes beyond the growth of the startup as well. So we show it impacts VC outcomes. It also impacts product development outcomes. And it's sort of, there's an idea here that there's sort of early mistakes, right, in terms of what ideas get traction, right? Early mistakes in that sort of demand estimation of what the market wants might lead to too few startups that are serving the needs of women. And so I'll walk through all this in more detail. If you've got questions, feel free to dump them in the chat. One you might be thinking is, well, Ram, now that you've explained this, doesn't this solve the problem, right? Now, all these sort of female-focused startups on Product Hunt, they could just know and sort of correct the inference, right? They could correct for the sampling bias. I can talk about at the end of the talk why that's not the case. The simple intuition is it's better to learn from larger than smaller samples. So if I'm a female-focused startup, I'm only learning from a couple of users versus a male-focused startup is learning from dozens or hundreds of users, right? And you can imagine just having a more precise signal is value for the entrepreneur. We have an updated version of the paper that walks through that. It's something I often get when presenting the paper, which I think is a great criticism, but one I think that we've addressed in the new version. So let me walk you through sort of the framing a little bit of the paper, and then I'll start diving into the results. And so where this paper sits, right, is that the value, we know there's a lot of value in entrepreneurs running experiments, right? And the idea is that it reduces idiosyncratic bias in their decision-making, right? So there's a paper that came out in Management Science by Camufo, Cordova, Gambardella, and Spina, in 2020, fantastic paper where they run a randomized controlled trial and they teach entrepreneurs to use a scientific approach, right? To define a clear A/B test, to define a clear hypothesis, test it with an A/B test if they can, or with interview data, right? But to really go out and experiment with the world to see if they're right or wrong in their hypotheses, right? And what they find is when startups do that, they perform better, right? They shut down bad ideas faster, right? And they end up doubling down on the good ideas much more quickly, and they see more growth. In a paper that I have with Sher Kassan and Ronnie Chatterjee, both at Duke, we show a similar sort of finding with startups adopting A/B testing tools. We show that when startups adopt A/B testing tool, and that's this figure down here on the right, or on your right, they see much more growth afterwards. So when startups experiment, it has value. And the reason we think it matters is that entrepreneurs fundamentally face uncertainty. They don't know what's going to work. What's the right pricing? What's the right go-to-market strategy? What should I emphasize in the marketing around a particular new product that I'm launching to market? With experimentation, you can learn what works and what doesn't, and sort of hill climb to greater startup success. The issue, though, is even with experiments reducing this idiosyncratic bias, is the direction of experimentation can in and of itself still be biased. There can be bias in what experiments you run. Here, I've got a screenshot from a paper that I did with Samsa Samila and John Paul Ferguson that came out in Science last year. What you're seeing here in the first panel is just the difference between female-focused patents, patents focused on women's health, and patents focused on men's health. The first panel, panel A, is showing you that inventors from male majority teams, where 50% of more of the inventors on a patent are men, right, disproportionately focus on the needs of men. Panel B, showing female majority teams. They're more likely to focus on the needs of women, right? That's why the line is positive there. However, there's very few female inventors. And so the net result is that the overall sort of direction of invention, right, ends up being focused more towards the needs of men than to women, right? And tying this back to this idea of experimentation, you can think of scientists as sort of running little mini experiments around their ideas. If the experiments they're choosing to run, right, are fundamentally focused on one group and not another, it doesn't matter how unbiased the experiment is, you're not testing the right hypotheses. And so we could imagine in the case of entrepreneurship, right, if most entrepreneurs are men, maybe we're not testing enough ideas that are focused on the needs of women. Right, so this paper, other work I have, explore these sorts of issues, thinking about the relationship between experimentation and the direction of innovation in terms of who's benefiting. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is not whether the idea, whether we're testing these female-focused ideas or not, because maybe all inventors are men, but are we testing on the wrong samples? Right. And so there's a wonderful book by the feminist Caroline Criado Perez called Invisible Women that talks about this in sort of animal studies of mice. Right. Generally, when people run very early stage trials on animals, they do it with all male populations. There's been a lot of debate. I think the evidence is a little inconclusive still, but a lot of debate, right, that this distorts the direction of innovation. Distorts the direction of innovation away from discovering potentially adverse reactions in women. If we're testing only on male biology, maybe we're missing out adverse reactions or potential benefits if we test on a more mixed group. Right. I think the work of Jane Wu, another recent graduate of MIT who's now at UCLA, thinking about this for testing the risk of injury in car crashes. We tested with male dummies, right? Our sample was all male dummies. It didn't include sort of female anatomical dummies and male anatomical dummies that ended up having an impact, right, on who got safer cars in some sense, that cars were designed to be more safe for men than for women, right? So the sample we test on, not just who generates the idea, might matter for the direction of innovation. And so what I'm going to talk about today is how platforms play a part in this. And this is where I think it really connects to the sort of the theme of this seminar series. Increasingly, the way entrepreneurship works is an entrepreneur builds a MVP, a minimum viable product, for a female-focused, let's say, technology product. They're then going to go on a platform like Product Hunt to scale, validate their idea. But you could imagine there's lots of other platforms they could go to. They could go to Kickstarter. They could go to Indiegogo. They could go to Y Combinator's Hacker News. They could go to Product Hunt, as I'm suggesting here. What's interesting about all these platforms is they are dominated by men. 75% of Kickstarter's visitors are men, 67% of Indiegogo's visitors are men, 80% of YC's Hacker News readers are men, and 90% of Product Hunt users are men. If you look at PitchBook, which is a database of startups, right, and I take the fraction of visitors, right, who are male or female to any sort of venture-backed startup, right, even for the top decile, the top ventile of startups, right, what you see is that there are still more men visiting those websites than women, right? And we can imagine there's lots of reasons why this might be the case: occupational segregation, Silicon Valley's sort of culture. You could go on and on. Overall, what we see is that who's engaging on these digital platforms are overwhelmingly male. And so the issue is, if I build this minimum viable product and I go launch it on a platform like Product Hunt to scale and validate my idea, you can imagine if I don't have the ability to correct for it, or just because I'm getting a worse signal because there's less women who could provide data on whether my idea is good, that might lead to distortions in my inferences about whether my product would appeal to women. Right. And so you could imagine that would distort my decision to either continue growing a startup, shut down the startup, move on to something else. And so what we're going to try to do is unpack this idea of sampling bias in entrepreneurial experiments on the setting of Product Hunt, right? To see, do we see that startups that are female focused, not necessarily female run, ones that are addressing the needs of women, right, if they end up responding to these bias signals. And so with that, I'm now going to dive into the data so you have a sense of where we're going. I think there's a larger question here as we look around digital platforms, right, and who gets to participate on them and who ends up on them, on how they distort what sort of products and innovations succeed, who benefits from them. I think there's another really interesting question that I'll plant here, and I'll return to the inclusion of, like, why can't we start a more female-focused Product Hunt, right? What's preventing the market from doing that? So the first thing we need to do, now that you sort of have a sense of where I'm going with this talk, is we need to be able to measure whether a product, right, whether a new product that's launched on Product Hunt is ex ante more likely to appeal to men or more likely to appeal to women, right? That's like the first step that we need to do. And so the issue is, an early stage product doesn't have a lot of users. So we can't look at who's using it, right? And I'd be nervous about using the realized share of men or women after launching on Product Hunt, because we know Product Hunt is very male focused, right? Or has many more men on the platform. So if we have many more men on the platform, those shares might not be reflective of the underlying sort of gender direction of the product. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn to text analysis. And we're going to sort of flip the fact that we know word embedding models. In this case, we're just using Word2Vec. When we started this paper, we used to say that was state of the art. Now we can say it's tried and true, and there's much more state of the art things out in NLP land. And we're going to measure the product's gender focus by flipping around the fact that these models pick up stereotypes and biases. They also pick up preferences, and use it in our favor. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the words male and female in this large 300-dimensional semantic space that these word embeddings exist in, and we're going to map all the other words that describe a product that's launched on Product Hunt, right, onto the line that connects the word male and the line that and female. Right. And so in this way, basically what we're going to be able to do is pick up whether the sort of the bag of words that describes a startup are more associated with the word female or more associated with the word male. And so at first, when Sam came up with his idea, I thought it was bananas. I thought it was not going to work. I'm happy to report that I was completely wrong. Sam was right. And it led to what we think is a pretty interesting paper. And so the text we're taking, here's a launch of Todoist Foundations. We're taking the title text, a little tagline. There's a little explanation. You can see Todoist Foundation is the fastest, most intuitive, most reliable Todoist yet, sort of describing what it does. There's also a longer post that's the first comment, even before the product gets any votes on Product Hunt, where they describe sort of all the things that the product does. They sort of, it's like a press release in some sense. And we're going to take this press release, it's generally a couple paragraphs of text, and we're going to feed it through this algorithm and basically map it onto, are the words closer to female or male? And so here are the examples, right? I think if you're doing this sort of text analysis, first order thing to do is just make sure that you have some face validity. So what you're seeing in this table is different percentiles of this distribution. The first percentile of our female focus measures. So these are the most negative. So these would be the most male focused. You've got thanks, bro, generate random jargon-laced emails. I guess bro gets us there. Beard Bib 2.0, a hair clipping catcher from Beard King. That does seem like there would be more male users, or they'd have a preference for the product. Ball Metric, your favorite plays from the NBA. Obviously, this is capturing differences both in realized demand for who watches the NBA, but also stereotypes. So we have to be careful when we're thinking about this sort of text. On the flip side, if we go to the 99th percentile on the most female focus, it seems to be doing a really good job. Wonder, an app for queer and lesbian women to express their uniqueness, an app for women's menstrual health, one for pregnant women. What's also nice is that if you start digging into the distribution, there does seem to be evidence that it's not just the extremes that are capturing differences in how female or male focused a startup ideas. So the one that I really like to point out is Junko right here. The 75th percentile, a personal diversity and inclusion AI coach for managers. You could imagine that women, right, women workers might have greater demand for a manager or for using that product in their firm than men, because we know of the history of sexism in the workplace, right? And so you can imagine that maybe this word embedding is picking up something that's a little bit more continuous, a little bit more subtle, not quite as obvious. And so beyond showing you some examples, we do a bunch of validation in the paper using the data that we have from Product Hunt to show that it does indeed seem to correlate with differences in future demand. So here I'm going to show you one validation that we do. So this is the product's estimated female focus. It's just standardized to have mean 0, standard deviation 1. So here we're running from -2 standard deviations to 2. Right is more female focused. The y-axis is the share of products with a female maker, a female entrepreneur on Product Hunt. As you can see, the vast majority of entrepreneurs on the platform are men. But as the product becomes more female focused, we go from roughly 15%, right, of the teams having a female maker to 30% of the makers being female, a doubling, right? This is consistent with the work I mentioned earlier that I've done, where we're looking at whether female inventors are more likely to invent for women. We're looking at the opposite conditional, but similar idea, reassuring as well that it's relatively linear, right, in terms of the trend that we're seeing. We can also look at voting behavior. So I can take the count of male votes, that's the y-axis on panel A on the left, and the log count of female votes on the right, that's panel B. And what you're seeing is the product's estimated female focus. As we move from very male focused to very female focused products, the total number of votes from men declines, In contrast, on the right, we see as we move from very male products to very female products, right, the total number of votes from women increases, right? This seems strong evidence, right, that what we're capturing is differences in how much a product is likely to appeal to men or women. Finally, we can use some data. We have a question, Hongi?
Oh, yeah, just a quick question. So like these word embeddings are completely off the shelf from the Word2Vec library, right? This is not trained on further like fine tuning, right?
Yes, so we are doing. So when I said they were state of the art, they are now like this is the most mundane thing you could possibly do in NLP land. So we are taking the Facebook word embeddings trained on the Wikipedia corpus.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, like,
so
that's
very standard.
That means that the correlation is even more impressive, right? Because you're not training it on like whether or not.
No, we're not training it on the product hunt stuff. We're not doing anything.
Exactly.
And I think it works on the Wikipedia because these tech products, like if you look at Todoist, aren't super technical. So I've done this work on the patent data. And if you take the Wikipedia, if you take this approach and you apply it to patents, particularly biomedical patents, it completely falls apart. Because it just doesn't have enough. So there, we've done our own training and like basically fit our own models, and then we can recover it and everything works great. But yeah, basically the Wikipedia text is similar enough to the product hunt text that I think it does a pretty good job out of the box on generalizing. Great question.
Awesome.
Last one that I'll show you on this validation is we can actually use proprietary data that we got from Product Hunt, and we can look at the probability of what we're going to do is take the set of men and women who show up to the platform on a given day, right? And look at the homepage. And then we're going to look at what they vote on. So this basically gives us choice data where we know the startups they didn't vote for and the startups they did vote for. And we can basically estimate the difference in the female minus male upvote probability while including startup fixed effects, right? Because we're looking within, and including voter fixed effects. So we're controlling for the fact that maybe women are harsher or less harsh in voting. We're netting that all away. We're controlling for differences in startup quality. And what we're finding is the probability of a vote increases as we move from very male focused to very female focused products, right? These numbers on the y-axis are very small because on average, people will vote for like 1 in 100 products. It ends up being a meaningful effect size. It's something like a 20-25% increase in the probability of voting for the product. So hopefully with that, I have now convinced you that this measure isn't total bunk, which I think is really important. I don't think we talk enough about validating our measures when we go out and we apply these new NLP tools. And I think as we see people using OpenAI and GPT-3 and all this fanciness, right, I think we want to really make sure that we're capturing the concept that we care about in our studies. With that said, now let's dive into what happens to these female-focused products when they launch on Product Hunt. So do these male-dominated platforms lead to a product growth gap? And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to use data from SimilarWeb. So if you haven't used SimilarWeb, they're sort of like Google Analytics, but for any website. So we're going to take the monthly web traffic data from SimilarWeb. We're going to merge it to the 6,000 products that launch on Product Hunt. It's going to give us panel data at the product level for 6 months before the startup launches on Product Hunt and 12 months after the product hunt. So what's cool is we've got pre-post data, so we can include fixed effects for the product and the calendar month. And our key variable of interest is going to be interaction between the gender focus of the startup and whether they've launched on the platform or not, right? And so this will allow us to see if there are any differences in pre-trends, do all your sort of standard setup for this kind of panel data. And so let me show you the first one. Here on the y-axis, you've got log page visits. We can do it with other modeling approaches. We get the same thing. The x-axis is months since Product Hunt launch. So 6 months before launch, all the way to 12 months after launch. You see 2 lines here, along with 95% confidence intervals. The dashed line is gender neutral products. That's the middle quartile of the distribution. So if I go all the way back to this, it's from the 75th percentile to the 25th percentile, right? Anything in that we're going to call gender neutral. 75 and above, we're going to call female focused. 25 and below, we're going to call male focused. And so what you're seeing here are female focused, top quartile, gender neutral, middle quartiles. And what you see is clearly there's anticipation effects, but startups are trying to grow. Before they launch on Product Hunt, they're looking for other ways to grow the number of people who are visiting their websites. Totally reasonable. What we see is that those lines overlap before launching on Product Hunt. We then see they launch on Product Hunt, and that big jump that you see, right, that giant jump that you see here, that's launching on Product Hunt. Product Hunt does increase the number of people who come to your website. It's probably a good idea, no matter the gender focus of your product, to launch on Product Hunt if you care about increasing user growth, right? Like that is clearly valuable. However, what you see is that in the year after, in the 12 months after, and again, this is data from outside of Product Hunt, in the 12 months after, what you see is a persistent gap that emerges between the female-focused products and the gender-neutral products. The gender-neutral products are outperforming those female-focused products, right? And remember, this is a log scale, so that difference is actually quite sizable. It corresponds to roughly a 40% difference in user growth. I can show you that difference. So this is just that same graph, but instead of showing you levels, I'm just going to show you the difference. And so what you see is before launching, there doesn't look to be any sort of difference in the growth trends. And then post-launching, what we see is 40–50% lower growth for the female compared to the gender neutral products. At this point, I generally get a comment from someone who is an IO economist. That's been my history with this one, saying, well, duh, the market size for female-focused products is just smaller. There's fewer people who can vote. Of course, their growth is going to be smaller after launching the platform. You're going to find exactly the same thing for the male-focused products, right? This is just, Econ 101. And that's when I turn to this slide, which is we're showing you exactly the same thing. Gender-neutral products are the dashed line, middle quartiles. The red line is male-focused products. Right. And we see no such growth gap, right? Those are basically on top of one another. If I show you the difference, there's no difference between them, right? So it doesn't look like just by being at the end of one of these gender spectrums, at least when you launch on Product Hunt, right? It's a capping your growth. The effect seems to be concentrated on these female-focused products. I can turn to regression results and show you the estimates here. So post-launch, that's obviously going to be large. It looks like you just get a lot more visitors from launching on Product Hunt. Then we do post-launch times female product times male product, right? And so you can see male product, there's no difference relative to the gender-neutral baseline. Female products are about 46% less. Right, see 46% less growth afterwards. I think what's really cool, though very depressing, is in column 3, we can include interaction for whether someone on the team is a female maker or female entrepreneur. And consistent with a very large body of work, we find that women created ventures see less growth, roughly 40% less growth. However, in column 4, what you see is that difference in who makes the product doesn't explain our effect. It's not like this bias is against the founder. We can control for whether the maker is female. We can include whether the product is female focused, both roughly lower growth by 35–40%. We can do interaction terms. We don't find much in terms of an interaction between those two. And then finally, in column 5, we can restrict our sample to male makers. And so this is men making female-focused products, and we find the effects hold there. So I think we're picking up something different than the gender of the entrepreneur. It's something about the sort of gender focus of the idea. Yeah?
For the female maker dummy, is it flagged when it's a single female maker, or even teams of combinations of female and male makers are also flagged as well?
Great question. So we're doing if there's any woman on the maker team. And the reason is there's just a shockingly, depressingly, alarmingly few all-female teams, right? Like there's just no power. You can't answer it. It's, I've run into this issue, and I think it's Emmanuel Yimfor at Michigan's doing some really cool work on race and entrepreneurship, which I'm really impressed by, because one of the things, if you're studying like Series A founders and you're looking at the number of like Black founders, statistical power stops you from doing studies because there's just so few and the problem is so stark, right? And similarly here, there are just very few all-female teams. And so as soon as you start doing controls and stuff, it gets really wonky really fast. So we just say, is there a woman? So most of these female maker teams, it's probably a man and a woman working on the startup together. And you still get that very large negative effect, which I think is really interesting.
I see, thanks.
And so we find it with the all-male teams as well, which I think is definitely worth noting and suggests that I think when we start thinking about gender effects, particularly because women might be more likely to work on products that are aimed at the needs of women, right, that some of the biases we might see in the world might be conflating the gender of the entrepreneur with the gender of the product that they're generating, right? And so I think sort of unpacking these differences between who's doing the inventing and who they are inventing for, really fertile ground for future work. Moving forward. And so we can switch out log monthly page visits. I'm going to show you another regression table, have a sip of your coffee, eat some salad, same thing. We can flip it around to a dummy on whether there's anybody visiting your website in that month. We get the same effects. So the question now is, I think these results in and of themselves are really interesting, right? It suggests that when female-focused products launch on these platforms, they get less benefit from it, right? And so that's an interesting first-order effect. I think the question now is mechanism. Is it really sampling bias? If we could somehow get more women onto the platform, would that actually reduce that gap, right? Or is it something else about the platform, the nature of the ideas that might still be concerning, but not necessarily rooted in this sort of idea of sampling bias that I set up at the beginning? And so to explore the sampling bias one, we don't have a perfect solution. I wish we had the RCT. That would have been awesome. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to rely on a newsletter that Product Hunt sends out. So on a typical day, 90% of the beta testers, the users on the platform, are men. To get exogenous variation in the composition of beta testers, unrelated to the startup's launch on that day, we're going to use the newsletter that Product Hunt sends out every morning. And the newsletter gets sent out between 7 and 10 a.m. Pacific, which is actually after most products launch. Because you want to get the maximum amount of exposure you can over the day, the products that we analyze overwhelmingly, like 99% of them, launch very early in the day. They launch like midnight, a little after midnight, so that they maximize their exposure over the whole day. So all those projects get launched. Then there's a newsletter that comes out 7 a.m. To 10 a.m. Pacific. And through talking to Product Hunt, what we learned is that newsletter, right, is decided weeks in advance, right? And so I'm going to show you two of the newsletters. Here's one. There's a NERCS sponsored newsletter. NERCS does sort of mail order D2C birth control. You can see that it's an ad. That ad, I am sure, was placed, many weeks before. It's on February 21st, which I don't think is any particular special date, on February 21st, and it comes out. And my gut says the startups launching that day don't know that NERCS ad is happening. Similarly, there's another one talking about the acquisition of Mirror. Again, I think for regulatory reasons that couldn't have been announced beforehand. Again, I don't think the startups are going to be launched on that particular timing their launch around that particular day. And so what we're going to use is the fact that, as you can see in these two newsletters, you could imagine that these newsletters might appeal more to female readers and drive more female traffic to the Product Hunt website. And so what we can do in the paper, I don't know if I have the slide here. What we do in the paper is that we can show, right, using data. Again, this is some of our proprietary data, so it doesn't perfectly align with our sample, which causes a little bit of issues in terms of our analysis strategy, which is that we can show that the number of active female users who visit a product's page, or vote for a product on days where the newsletter features more female-focused products launched in the past or described in the past. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our word embedding, we'd apply it to the NERCS newsletter, we'd apply it to that next newsletter. So this is not products launched that day described in the newsletter. These are other things. Generally, a lot of the text we're using is they'll describe, in most of the newsletters feature, products that had previously been featured on Product Hunt. So Mirror, for example, has a Product Hunt page, right? They launch independently, but they eventually did a Product Hunt launch. It gets described. And so we're going to use that data on the newsletter and use those text embeddings again. And what we're going to do is create a measure for how female sort of focused the newsletter is. And so you can see, is this a female newsletter? And what we find is that going from the least to the most female newsletter leads to many more women to visit the homepage, vote for products, be engaged with the platform. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use this newsletter shock, right, to try to isolate days when we think the gap would be smaller. If there are really more women coming to the website, the gap should be smaller. Ideally, we could use this newsletter shock as kind of an instrument for the number of women who visit the page. This is where the data issue came in. We don't have the proprietary data from Product Hunt for our entire sample period. It turns out there were some analytics issues that stopped that from happening. And so we just don't have the power to be able to run that sort of full IV strategy. So basically what I'm going to show you is kind of intent to treat effects, right? We know there are more women, or likely more women, showing up on the website the day the newsletter is more appealing to women, right? We don't know how many. And then we're just going to look at, on those days we think there are more women there, right? We estimate from the regression I just showed you, does that close the gap? And so the first thing I'm going to show you is that we can take the 419 days that we have in our sample. We can take the days where the top quartile of female newsletters, the bottom quartile of female newsletters. I can show you that there's a difference in the average female newsletter score. That's that significant t-test that you see all the way on the right. But everything else about the products launched on those days don't look any different. Right. So this is sort of like a bounce test, right? What we're showing here is that it doesn't look like there's any difference in the sorts of products that get launched when the newsletter happens to be very female focused, or whether the newsletter happens to be very male focused. And so what I'm going to show you here is the difference in user growth 1 year after launch. If I go all the way back here, I'm just basically showing you the regression estimate right here. I'm just showing you that graph, or sorry, next one. I'm showing you this regression estimate. You can think of it as basically, I'm just showing you the average growth, right, for the 12 months after launch, right, instead of showing it dynamically. And let me go to that graph. And so what I'm showing you here is that average estimate. The x-axis here is the female newsletter shock quartiles. So the first quartile is the most male-focused newsletters, the second most male, third, and then the top is the most female-focused one. The y-axis is that difference that I was just describing about. And what you see is for the 50% of newsletters that are the most male-focused, right, we get big negative effects, right? For the third bucket, we're overlapping with 0, but that's noisy. The point estimate is negative. For the fourth bucket, we've still got pretty wide standard errors, but we are shrinking, right? And if we did this as a triple interaction, you'll see that actually, indeed, it is shrinking. I'm hesitant to say that the shocks turn off the gap, right? It's a relatively noisy estimate. It could still be quite large and negative, but it does look like whatever the effect is, it is getting smaller. So I'm going to say the gap is shrinking. I'm not comfortable saying that the gap gets completely turned off. I think that just pushes the limits of what our data can say. We can do sort of a placebo test and say, what's the effect of the newsletter shock on male-focused products? We find no such relationship in terms of reducing the difference compared to gender-neutral products. Perhaps on the most female-focused days, right, there's a more negative estimate, but I am not going to bet on that one. It's intriguingly exciting, but I don't think there's probably a real effect there just because there's so many more men on the platform, right? So I think we're probably going from, 9 and 10 of the people on the platform being men to like, 8 and 10, something along those lines. And so here's the results as a regression. Post-launch, our newsletter shock, we have scaled the newsletter shock to run from 0 to 1 to aid in interpretability. So 0 is the most female-focused newsletter, 1 is the most, 0 is the most male-focused newsletter, 1 is the most female-focused newsletter. Then we've got that triple interaction. What you see is post-launch times female focus. We get a negative effect. The triple interaction basically cancels that out. Right, as we move from the most male focus to the most female focus, we are reducing that effect. It holds within our all male maker sample as well, right? So again, speaking to this idea that it's about the sample that you're testing with and who the idea appeals to, and not the gender of the entrepreneur per se. So the question then is, beyond growth, right? Does this impact entrepreneur investor behavior, right? If you think about models of entrepreneurial experimentation, a lot of what's happening is I'm going on this platform, I'm seeing what happens to my growth, I'm realizing some outcome in terms of whether my startup succeeds or my startup fails, and then I make a decision. Do I continue to invest in the startup? Do I go get a job back at Google or Facebook or Lyft? Do I decide to go, can I convince VC investors that to give me money, right? If I get more growth, in theory, VC should be more receptive, right, to investing in my startup. And so we don't have perfect evidence on this. I wish we had surveys of all 6,000 founders and what they were thinking and how they were updating their beliefs over time, but they were launching a startup. They were busy. So we're going to use 2 other data sets that kind of give us some evidence into how entrepreneurs and how venture capitalists might be impacted by what I've shown you here. And so the first one I'm going to show you is, do entrepreneurs continue to develop the product? So we're going to use data from builtwith.com. If you haven't played with Builtwith and you're interested in digitization, strongly recommend you go pull it up for a minute. And basically what it tracks is front-end web technology. And so in the paper on A/B testing, we use the Builtwith data to look at when firms adopt A/B testing software. It tracks analytics software. You can see some examples of the sorts of things it tracks: Optimizely, Google Analytics, Heap, a bunch of ad tracking, all sorts of different software, anything that has to be installed in the JavaScript at the front of a website. And so what we can do is we're going to use Builtwith API to pull the tech stacks for the 6,000 startups that launch on Product Hunt as of October 2020. So this is after they've all launched. It's a year or 2 after they've launched. We're going to get their technology stacks and basically see, do we see female-focused startups developing smaller technology stacks? And does that shock I just reduce the gap? Right? With the idea being that if entrepreneurs get a bad draw, right? They test on this bias sample, it doesn't go well. They're going to be like, I don't know if it's really worth investing the time in this. They might not pay for the upgraded piece of analytics technology. They won't spend the time coding in these new pieces of technology. And so it gives us sort of a measure of product development in some sense. And indeed, when we run the regression, we find this. We find that female-focused startups have smaller technology stacks on average, roughly 20, 30% smaller. And when there's a newsletter shock, that erases the gap. Right? These are noisy estimates because we have to rely on our cross-sectional data. We don't get the panel data here. We just have their technology stacks as of 2020, right? But consistent with this idea that sampling bias is driving entrepreneurial decision-making, what we find here is that the shock seems to cause them to invest more, right, in developing their product, at least in terms of the technology they're using on their website. We can also look at whether investors respond to the signal. And this is where actually a lot of the ideas for this paper came from, was actually an article in Bloomberg back in 2017, looking at a smart breast pump company that was struggling to raise money. The VCs really didn't like it. And in fact, the woman who founded the company sent her co-founder, who was a man, to do the pitching, thinking that it was gender bias against her. And the VCs still didn't like it because they didn't want to touch it. They thought it was gross. They were uncomfortable with the idea that it was a female-focused product. And so we could imagine that maybe there's a gap in funding for these female-focused products, but if I got better growth signals, might that close the gap? And so what we're going to do is you can use data from Preqin and Crunchbase, and we're going to measure investment outcomes as of October 2020. Again, we're moving away from our panel data setting. We're going to move to cross-sectional data. And again, what you're seeing here is same sort of idea of the interaction. We're going to have female focus, again, where everything is post, so we don't have the triple interaction. Female-focused startups are less likely to receive VC funding. When we do the shock, that erases the gap. These are big estimates. I'm not sure how much I buy the point estimates here. VC funding outcomes are a relatively rare event. So even with 5,742 products, I'm just not sure how well powered we are. So we're going to get some noisy estimates. What I am comforted by, though, is that there is a gap, right? So more female-focused products are less likely to raise VC funding post-launch. And it does look like the shock, getting a better sample, might reduce that gap, right? Though that's really stretching the limits of our data, if I'm being perfectly honest. So conclusion and next steps, what have we learned? Putting it all together. The composition of early users on the day of product launches impacts growth, survival, investment, and entrepreneurial effort a year after launch. I think what's really cool about this in terms of a platform paper, right, is we're not just using outcomes on the platform, right? I love me a good a platform paper where you're looking at things just on Upwork or just on Uber, but we're actually able to link it to growth outcomes, venture capital outcomes, and product development outcomes from outside the platform. So if we want to understand how these platforms are changing things like entrepreneurship, right, we'd really love to have data not just from the platform itself, but on other aspects of the company in terms of its overall performance, right? You could imagine that female-focused startups just get fewer votes on Product Hunt, but they make up the growth in other ways, right? Our results suggest that there are frictions and their ability to drive growth through other channels. Here, we're showing that sampling bias can corrupt entrepreneurial experiments. Beyond gender, what about race, geography, business experience? I think if you sort of generalize the model up and you think of entrepreneurs as fundamentally sampling the world, looking for interesting signals about where there's promise, looking for interesting problems, how does bias and who gets to be an entrepreneur or an innovator shape the sorts of problems that we end up working on, right? So you could imagine that, one thing that people talk a lot about is like neglected tropical diseases is the fact that I don't see them on a daily basis, right? Mean that I'm less interested in solving them, right? We can also think about platforms as reifying existing biases and broadcasting corrupt signals, which might shift the direction of innovation, right? I think on net, Product Hunt is probably pretty good. It's opening up access to more people, but I think there are interesting questions about, do they reify the biases that already exist in society? If 90% of Silicon Valley is male, right, or of engineers and people working in startup land is male, right? When we build a platform, why would we expect the composition to be any different? And so in some sense, what I like about it is it lets us measure. On the other hand, it raises thorny issues in terms of who gets to participate and whose voice is heard. Finally, this paper illustrates a larger idea that I've been working on product market bias, which is bias that impacts consumers, not just entrepreneurs, right? Often in studies, what we try to do is we hold an idea constant. We have like a resume audit study, and we show you two of the same resumes, right? We change the gender of the person who's applying. But if we think our differences have value, right? That female candidate might have different experiences, might have different preferences, might come up with different ideas, right? Holding things constant is actually causing us to miss out on a lot of really interesting ideas that could end up benefiting consumers. So I think as we think about what digital products get built or who's designing, new AI or ML systems, thinking about not just holding constant their ideas to see if there's bias in terms of who's creating them, but thinking about whether they create different sorts of ideas and whether those would benefit different sorts of people. Really interesting and open area for more research, something I'm working on and would love to see more papers on as well. And so with that, I will say thank you. I'm Rem at hbs.edu. Thanks for spending your lunch with me, and I'll stick around for some questions. Looking forward to them.
Oh, I'm gonna ask David's question first.
Actually,
David,
I'm gonna jump in, Hongi, because I'm speaking from a slight space of knowledge. So I have a foot in the angel world, Rem, and
Yep.
and I see angel groups like Gangels and Golden Seeds and
Yep.
others moving the needle at the pre-seed and seed stage space, particularly with women and other minorities. Have you looked at any data in that space? Because I think the VC world is different from the angel world, I guess, is what I'm saying.
Yes, I think that the angel one, I've seen a ton of examples of that. And I think it's really important. So actually, one of the we were talking to an angel investor when we were sort of thinking about this study. And one of the, he will remain unnamed, but he was like, oh, I passed on an investment. And I think it was like VR nail salon tech. So you could sort of visualize the color and pattern on your nails. And he was like, I passed on it not because like, I'm biased, or, I'm sexist or anything. I just don't understand the space, like I wouldn't get it. Right. And like, I think that's exactly the thing where, you often hear this. I do a lot of work on femtech where, a male founder will be like, let me go ask my wife and see if or a male VC will be like, do they like it? And so this is where I think on the angel side, you're 100% right. As we see more female angels, I think it should help the sorts of ideas that'll get funded. But let me be very clear too. They shouldn't be pigeonholed to only investing in those ideas. Right. There's some great work by Camille Hebert, who's up at Toronto, a finance prof there, showing that there are stereotypes in where people will invest. So it might be actually harder for women working in, let's say, like B2B SaaS that's very male dominated to succeed. All right. And so we want to find ways to leverage our differences to find opportunities, but not be sort of pigeonholed them. So I wouldn't, suggest all female, all women who are angel investors only invest in femtech, for example. I think that's one of the benefits among many of sort of promoting this sort of diversity. It would be cool. I think I could check some of that on PitchBook pretty easily. I wonder how much there's been a rise and where they're investing. I like that.
Also the Angel Capital Association is doing some data there. By the way, I did look at the smart breast pump. And there's one other thing that probably bears mentioning, that a lot of VCs have an aversion to husband and wife teams or other teams where there's a relationship. And there was in that particular case as well. So there might have been a little bit of an externality.
Oh, so that one, yeah. So Naya ends up shutting down. What's interesting is that you get Elvie and Willow, which have both taken off since. Right. Similar sorts of issues there. And so I think it's one of those things where there's tons of friction in that market. It also turns out just building a smart breast pump is just really hard tech. Like it's just a non-trivial, like no offense to my SaaS friends, building something that actually pumps milk from a human is hard. And some of the engineering they have to do is really hard. And so there's definitely more to that. I don't want to suggest a monocausal explanation here.
So Bevan Wathen is trying to ask a clarifying question. Whether or not are the NLP tools only based in English language? So these are all English.
No.
Right?
You could definitely do this in other languages, and it would be awesome. So I know the word embedding has corpi that are trained on like other versions of Wikipedia, right, in other languages. I think with the OpenAI stuff and everything else, there's a lot of other ones in different languages now. That would be amazing to do. Right. Like I'm sure, right. I do a bunch of work in India. I've thought about doing stuff in vernacular there that would be really interesting. I'd love to see if the methods apply, like if you were looking at LATAM startups. I think all sorts of stuff. So great question.
And then from Gauri Subramani,
hey, Gauri.
You touched on it a little bit, but what do you think the results you find are coming from the founder side? Founders who lose faith in their idea after they get inaccurate data from a non-representative sample for customers, or effects on VC access to funding due to a lack of enthusiasm on product hunt.
So like, I think, so this is sort of anecdata from just talking to founders and entrepreneurs, right? Which is, I think the lack of early signals, particularly if they're not as strong as you like, are very demotivating. Right? How much the VCs are rational about that, I'm not quite so sure. I think VCs tend to invest based off narrative. And so maybe the growth plays into that narrative. But I think for the entrepreneurs, when you're not seeing that big user growth, you go launch on Product Hunt and you end up with nobody using your platforms 3 months later. Right. The people who are launching on these platforms are relatively technical. They've got outside options. I can imagine them abandoning, right, what they're working on. And we do see some evidence that, right, the margin that really matters here, that 40% lower growth is coming from a lot of female focused startups that end up just having 0 users. Right. So it's sort of an extensive margin where they're failing. Right. There's just no one coming to them. They don't get to that critical mass that lets them learn and then grow.
I have a clarifying question about the newsletter tool itself. So you might have gone over this, I might have missed it, but like when it comes to negotiating or the process of becoming part of the newsletter, highlighting process? Is that like a negotiation between the founding team and product hunt? Do they talk about it being featured, or is that sort of like an exogenous shock to them? Do they just like surprisingly realize it just got
Yeah, so
featured?
the key on the newsletter that's hard, right? And we've spent a lot of time trying to write this up in the new version of the paper, is that the newsletter products are not the products launched that day. So Hongi, you launch a product, the newsletter is featuring prior products that have been launched on Product Hunt. Sometimes they just feature things and they say, hey, this happened. With sometimes they go interview founders of prior products. Sometimes it's an ad, right? And so basically you can think there's a newsletter team that's basically not paying attention to what's being launched on the day of launch. That's just building out a pipeline of newsletters that they think are interesting in general. Some of them are tailored to current events. So in theory, right, take that mirror example I got being bought by Lululemon for $500 million. Maybe there was a startup that knew that was going to happen and thought, Product Hunt's going to feature that in the newsletter, and thus timed their entry. That seems crazy to me, right? And if it is, I think it's a pretty small part of the data. There are a few days where a product really blows up and does get featured in the newsletter, like very early on, very small. We exclude those from our data. We can do some stuff around robustness around that. It seems not to be a key driver behind our results. But most of the time, the newsletter is the vast majority of the time featuring other products, not ones launched those day on the day.
I see. So it does seem that like the highlighting of the newsletter, I mean, the build with it analytics is really cool, seeing that tech stack sort of being built out when you get highlighted. It does seem that it is partly because
that one I think is really
flood,
cool.
right?
I was a little shocked that one. I'll be honest.
And then Paula Klein has a question. Great to validate what we intuitively already know, but how do you use the data to make change and diversify platforms and entrepreneurship?
Great question, Paula. Super, super great question. So I would say like the most skeptical of me is that I think the results highlight that to get real change here is you need to change the composition of who is voting and who is building, right? So it's like just a bigger, harder problem, which is generally where I've come down on this sort of stuff. Raman and I have had this debate going back and forth on like, could you change the weightings of the information that you get on the platform? I'm a little skeptical because I think even if you could change the weightings and say, actually, we've adjusted your growth, right, based off your launch on Product Hunt, we know it should be 40% higher. That's a noisier estimate because you're just learning from fewer users. So, right, it's both that you're getting a bias signal, but you're getting a noisier signal if you're a woman, right? Because there's fewer users who are showing up. And so I think the sort of my takeaway, is you got to keep basically changing who works in tech, right? So if you look at who's on Product Hunt, a lot of the people are ex-Google engineers, they're venture capitalists, they're angel investors who are overwhelmingly men. Right. And so I think the real fix to this is these platforms are really powerful. Let's change who's participating to get them in more on the platform. I do think in the shorter term, there's interesting questions of can you build alternative platforms that are focused on the needs of other groups, right? So maybe focused on, international startups or on women's startups. But I think that's hard because a lot of these things seem to be coordinating devices where like I'm shocked by the quality of the VCs who spend an inordinate amount of time just like refreshing Product Hunt. Like it doesn't make sense to me, but they do it. And so I'm not sure if you created a separate platform, you get the same caliber of folks who are participating. But it's an awesome question when I'm thinking about on a daily basis.
And a follow-up from Mikhail Patikas. How about anonymizing votes and participation on these platforms? So
great question. You could totally anonymize votes and participation. My gut says that the mechanism in terms of the platform here is actually less about voting on Product Hunt and more about the publicity that Product Hunt builds in terms of people just seeing whether your startup launched, right? And so like basically, because we see it, the effect is on user growth. I think basically what's happening is you launch on Product Hunt, maybe you get a lot of votes, maybe you just get a lot of attention because a journalist shows up and shares your product, or Jorge Guzman, to go back to a very early example, shares your product on Twitter, and a bunch of people end up going to your Product Hunt. Maybe they're not logged in, so they can't vote, and they end up just going directly to your website instead, right? And so I think the way to think about it is that the mechanics of voting on Product Hunt and fixing, let's say, a vote gap, I don't think matters that much. I think what matters is how do you get more people showing up to the platform? So I think anonymizing votes or participation, I don't think would do much. Like that's my gut. I mean, we could try to look at like voters who have already anonymized or like have names that don't clearly reveal a gender. But my gut says that in this case, that's not where the action is happening.
Do you think, by the way, that like because this is such an early sort of stage product, like you only launch a product on probably as like a way to fundraise or to maybe get your name out there to the VC world, in a sense that like, are there other channels through which they usually launch these products in a pre-launch stage, like that could be competing and therefore could be more sort of informative for these
Maybe.
companies?
So Sequoia launched its own version of Product Hunt, and then YC has recently launched its own version of Product Hunt. But I'll bet my boots, right, that what we see is that they're all male dominated. Right. And so like, I think the issue is, and this goes back to Paul's question that's hard to solve, is that it just, the people who are building our technology and investing in our technology are so, that are overwhelmingly men, right? That I'm not sure there's like a clean or clear solution here. I wish there was, but I think the best solution is like, let's get more women into STEM. There should be more women in CS. We should have, the engineering and, data science teams at Google be 50-50 if we can. I think that's sort of where I fall down. And so I think this is further evidence that points to the importance of that sort of work.
So you think this like sort of selection bottleneck that's existing at the beginning of the founding process, it's so like deep that it's hard to even correct for it, right?
Yeah,
you mentioned earlier.
Let's say I don't go on Product Hunt. I go to AngelList and I talk to a couple, or I talk to some angels. I get the same thing. The other one that I love, inspired actually a little bit by chatting with your own Scott Stern, right, is think about early employees. One of the key things as a founder is I have to convince other people to leave potentially a high-paying job and do something crazy with me. And so if, let's say, all my peers are men and I'm like, I've got this idea to reinvent women's health, or there was a New York Times article that just came out about under research on the clitoris, I'm imagining if I go pitch them that, there might be giggles and there might be like, that's not for me. And so actually one of the projects I'm doing right now with Solène Delacourt, who would be great. You guys should get her out. She's doing some digital stuff. She's great. She's at Berkeley, where we're looking at, do male workers, particularly we're looking at data scientists and engineers, essentially have a preference for working at non-female type companies. So even if I could raise the money, I actually can't attract the labor. I need to grow my startup. So we're building our own hiring platform right now, and doing some cool RCTs, trying to understand what drives what sort of problems employees want to work on. Because I think we often forget founders are lovely, but or the reason they raise that venture capital or angel money from David is to go hire people, right, to build out their vision, right? And if it costs more to hire those people or they don't work on those problems, you can imagine the labor market preferences distorting the direction of innovation, right? Which again, sort of points us to think that's how intractable I think this problem really is.
Could you elaborate on the bias correction I think you mentioned at the beginning of the talk? Is that something that is doable here, or is it too difficult?
Like you could try like with algorithms and the bias correction. It would be cool. It would be an interesting experiment to see. I'm just super skeptical because I think all the channels where you're getting feedback have this sort of like are distorted by the gender imbalance that we see. So right, I'm a little skeptical on that one.
And the last question from Aurora and Sanjeev. Is, would you say that female founders would gain more success in ventures that are targeted towards both genders, like grocery and dating?
So I would say in our evidence on Product Hunt, it doesn't matter, right, what the gender focus is. It seems like they're operating relatively independently. There's other work, as I mentioned, by Camille Hebert that does show there's sort of stereotypes. My gut says on a lot of this, right, is finding signals of success early on are really important. Right. So one of our hypotheses in the experiment we want to test is like, if you can be like, I'm backed by a great Series A founder. I was just talking to a founder in a very different setting, this company Propel. They do a food stamps app, super cool company. Jimmy, who started it, was like, we had the hardest time raising venture capital because the VCs don't have lived experience of being on food stamps. It like just doesn't exist. And so he was like, it was hard to hire. It was hard to get funding. And then at some point, someone rebranded us as a fintech play and they raised from Andreessen. And suddenly he was like, everybody wanted to come work for us. And we were so exciting and it was so cool. And like, we can get this great talent. And I think that's where, if there are ways to get signals back to the earlier question, right, that can overcome some of the uncertainty or cause people to say, okay, great, maybe I'm comfortable working at the clitoris startup. But I see that Andreessen's a backer. This clearly is technologically sophisticated. These people are great. Because again, a lot of this entrepreneurship stuff is driven by the fact that we just have uncertainty over what's good and what's bad. And our experience has let us resolve some uncertainty and make us worse at dealing with others. And so that I think that's sort of where I'll end it at. But thank you, everybody, for the great questions and spending your lunch with me. This was super fun.
Thanks
you so much, Ram.
Appreciate it. And just for those of you who have some time, a week from today, we have Emil Palikot of Stanford talking about platforms and work of the future. Thanks again, Rem, and
Thank
take
you.
care, everybody.